curious, engaging. In the settlement of Mehrgar, practitioners were already using specialized stone drill bits to carefully excavate decay from living human teeth. By the time the Indus Valley civilization emerged, this precision had scaled into entire metropolises. These cities functioned on sophisticated grid systems, utilizing standardized brickwork and covered drainage that rivaled modern urban design. This stability allowed for a concentrated intellectual expansion. Under the Mauryan and Gupta empires, Indian mathematicians conceptualized the zero, while thousands of international scholars gathered at global learning hubs like Nalanda. This concentration of science and agricultural surplus made the subcontinent the primary engine of the global economy. However, that prosperity also fostered intense regionalism. The land fragmented into dozens of fiercely competing kingdoms, each focusing solely on local dominance rather than collective security. A focused question: if the region possessed such advanced technology, wealth, and urban organization, how did it remain vulnerable to repeated foreign conquest for nearly a millennium? The records of these invasions suggest a consistent pattern. India's historic vulnerability was rarely a lack of military skill. It was the recurring failure of its internal unity. In 1191, the Rajput king Prithvi Raj Chauhan successfully routed Muhammad Ghori's invading army. But shortly after the victory, a bitter feud with a neighboring king, Jaichand, led to Chauhan being betrayed by his own regional peers. This specific act of domestic betrayal removed the strongest regional buffer, leaving the door open for foreign powers to establish a permanent foothold in the north. The cultural losses that followed were total. The university at Nalanda was burned so thoroughly that its library reportedly smoldered for 3 months, while the wealth of the Somnath temple was systematically dismantled and carried away. When these kingdoms prioritized their local borders over their shared interests, they didn't just lose their crowns, they lost centuries of accumulated scientific and medical knowledge. In 1526, Babur seized the throne in Delhi, using highly disciplined tactics and the first effective use of gunpowder cannons on the subcontinent. But artillery alone couldn't maintain an empire. His grandson, Akbar, secured the Mughal hold through a strategy of assimilation, forming military alliances with Rajput kings and enforcing strict policies of religious tolerance. This internal stability allowed the empire to reach its architectural peak under Shah Jahan, who utilized vast tax revenues to construct the Taj Mahal. This formula was later abandoned by Aurangzeb. He enforced religious intolerance and drained the imperial treasury by pursuing endless, exhausting wars of expansion into the south. This shift sparked unrelenting resistance. Leaders like Shivaji Maharaj and Maharana Pratap launched localized guerrilla campaigns that paralyzed the Mughal administration and signaled the empire's decline. The historical lesson was clear. The empire thrived when it integrated its diverse subjects, and it began to collapse the moment it attempted to divide them. As the Mughal administration fractured from within, the British East India Company arrived, operating initially as a simple network of trading outposts. The British did not need a superior army to take control. They simply weaponized the regional animosities they found, perfecting a strategy of divide and rule. At the Battle of Plassey, they secured the wealthiest province in India without a full fight. They simply paid the Nawab's own commander, Mir Jafar, to withhold his troops during the battle. This chart tracks the resulting economic drain. As the company consolidated its hold on these fractured states, India's share of global GDP sank from nearly a quarter to less than 4%, as wealth was siphoned off to fuel the British industrial machine. The colonial era proved that even the richest civilization on Earth could be systematically looted if its people were convinced to fight each other rather than the thief. The realization of this dynamic finally arrived in 1857. After decades of extraction and cultural suppression, the fragmented population found a common cause. During the Great Rebellion, Hindu and Muslim soldiers united, marching to the Red Fort in Delhi to rally behind the last Mughal emperor in a collective effort to reclaim their sovereignty. The British responded with brutal suppression, leaving behind visible scars of violence to discourage any future attempts at coordinated resistance. But the precedent had been set. By the early 20th century, The push for freedom had evolved from isolated regional riots into a broad national mobilization under leaders like Mahatma Gandhi. Sovereignty was finally within reach because the population had begun to unlearn centuries of division, aligning against a single external administration. When independence finally arrived in 1947, it was accompanied by the deep trauma of partition, a final, violent division that displaced millions across new borders. The new government faced an immediate crisis. The British had left behind 562 semi-autonomous princely states, many of which threatened to remain outside the new republic. It took a tireless diplomatic campaign, led by Sardar Patel, to integrate these hundreds of fractured entities into a single, cohesive democratic state. This unified foundation allowed India to re-emerge as a modern scientific and economic power, developing its own digital infrastructure and successfully landing craft on the lunar South Pole. 11,000 years of history suggests that India's endurance does not come from its wealth or its weapons. It comes from the difficult, ongoing work